Hello and welcome to Live America podcast. This is Hatem, alongside me, the one and only Noam Dworman, owner of the Comedy Cellar. Hello,
Eh,
Noam.
Hello, I'm sorry if I look a little chipper. But yeah, go ahead.
I like the blue. And our guest of honor is Michel Paradis. He
Dun, dun, dun,
is a
dun.
human rights lawyer, Columbia Law professor, and a very good friend of mine in the show. And Noam, he is here to talk about his new book, The Light of Battle: Eisenhower, D-Day, and the Birth of the American Superpower. It's a story of the 34th president and how he learned uh, the politics of war in launching of D-Day. This is gonna be a movie. I know that. It's part biography, part political history, and the critics have been raving about this book, and I cannot wait to read it. And he's here. Michelle, welcome to the show.
Thank you much. Good to see you guys.
Since your last book, Mission to the Last Mission to Tokyo, I think you're gonna be a big movie writer. It's gonna happen.
I'll tell you, did they finally settle on a contract? They're not on strike anymore?
But this is
They're not
part
on
two.
strike. No,
That's good. I'm good.
sorry.
Yeah, so great to have you, man, in a crazy world. Your book is coming up on the 6th, correct? June 6th?
June 4th. It's out on June 4th at fine bookstores everywhere, and even some unfine bookstores. And it's just in time for D-Day, the 80th anniversary of which
Yeah.
is June 6th.
So why did you choose to write about D-Day? And what part, like when does it start exactly, your book?
Sure. So I'll take the last part first. So the book starts about 6 months before D-Day at something called the Cairo Conference, which is where the British and the American war planners get together in Cairo, which at that time was a part of the British Empire, and ultimately decide to launch the D-Day invasion. And I start there because probably one of the most consequential decisions that comes out of that conference is the choice to make Dwight Eisenhower, the 34th president of the United States, the leader of the D-Day invasion, the commander of Operation Overlord. And candidly, that's kind of what drew me to the project. As much as D-Day is fascinating, and I do talk a lot about that, obviously, in the book, Eisenhower just struck me as an utterly fascinating person. He is, probably one of the most powerful military officers, generals in all of human history. And he was raised in Kansas by two religious pacifists. He, he literally beat Hitler in World War II, but his fallback plan had, the army not worked out, was to go be a gaucho in Argentina. He's this guy who, is warned that the Nazis are preparing to use nuclear weapons against the D-Day invasion, and then told he can do nothing about it and he can't tell anyone. And so he focuses on what he can do something about and what he can control, and that's the weather. And that turns out to be probably his most consequential sort of command decision of the entire D-Day operation, if not the entire Second World War. So he's just an utterly...
Explain that, the weather.
Yeah. The weather, yeah. So the weather is, so Eisenhower gets this job in December of 1943, goes to London in January of 1944. And by that point, he had been fighting the Second World War in North Africa and in the Mediterranean, Sicily, and then Italy. And something he learned through hard experience is that the weather will often dictate victory or defeat, more than how many guns you have, more than how many soldiers or tanks you have. It's often just going to be up the weather. It's a terrain of battle. Mm-hmm. And when he gets to London, there are like dozens of weathermen. Everyone has their own weatherman. The Army has theirs, the Navy has theirs, the British Army has theirs, the British Navy has theirs. And so he gets this Scottish meteorologist, stuffs him in a military uniform, and essentially makes him the general of weather, to consolidate and organize all these predictions about the weather that are going in every which direction. And then really puts him on the spot, invites him to the weekly commanders meetings that he's having with his, Air Force commander and his ground commander and his naval commander. And each week says, okay, what's the weather going to be in 5 days? And he has to predict this, and he's put on the spot. And then the week later, they assess his predictions for their accuracy. And it got to the point week after week that Eisenhower could read this guy like a poker player, right? He could look at his face and know what the weather was going to be. And that proved probably to be the most important single thing Eisenhower did, because on June 3rd, the weather general, James Martin Stagg, comes to Eisenhower on what is probably one of the most beautiful days in English history. Blue skies, it's hot, it's the end of May, very atypical weather for Southern England, and comes to him and says, there is a storm a brewing. The channel is going to boil. The cloud cover is going to be opaque. You won't be able to use any air power at all. You can't use the airborne divisions. The seas are going to be so rough that the ships are likely to capsize before they ever get to land. And Eisenhower takes this to his commanders, and they have a choice. Do we postpone the invasion, which, if it goes on too long, will have to be postponed, for a month, and then they're going to lose all sorts of strategic surprise. There's all sorts of reasons why it would be disaster if they had to postpone D-Day by any more than a few days. And he makes the call. He's like, okay, we're going to postpone it by a single day. And that's not a gut level decision, right? That's a decision where if you're looking up at the sky, that looks crazy. And sure enough, about 18 hours later, the clouds come in, and the English Channel in southern England is racked by probably one of the most violent storms it had also seen in years. And James Martin Stagg, his weather general, comes to him again and says, our ships out in the Atlantic have essentially detected a weather system that's going to pull this storm out of the English Channel and give you a brief window of anywhere from 36 to 48 hours of clear skies and relatively calm seas. And the Germans can't predict it because they don't have our weather technology out in the Atlantic. And Eisenhower gets this prediction, brings all of his commanders together in this, old manor house in Portsmouth, where they have to make the decision. And the rain is just drumming against the windows. The wind is just howling through, the gaps of this old house. And he's sitting there at 4:30 in the morning, looking at his various commanders in silence, and has to just decide. And again, not on his gut, because your gut is, do not send anyone out in this storm. But he says, okay, let's go, and launches the D-Day invasion, so that by June 5th, the afternoon of June 5th, the skies begin to clear. He goes to see the 101st Airborne off that night, and basically just collapses in the back of his car and says to his driver, well, nothing can stop it now. And there's a decision, right? That's a decision if there ever was one. Someone who, comes into this, just whirlwind of complexity and danger, and has to make a call basically on what's the weather going to be. And ultimately, the James Martin Stagg was proven correct. The weather was perfect for just enough time for the invasion force to get across the English Channel to invade Normandy, and for the beginning of the end of World War II to begin.
It's amazing because, as we know, the weather is not very, even with all the technology we have today, they didn't even have satellites then. They get it wrong all the time, right? I just had a barbecue this weekend that was supposed to be covered in rain, and we had 2 hours of sunshine. So, he got it right, but he was extremely lucky, right? Extremely lucky.
Yeah, he was. He was. Some people used to call him divine destiny, because if Eisenhower, he had skill, and he made his own luck. But
I'm fascinating about this, because I know, when that they in general had only 3 days a month that they could have done this operation, because it's not only the weather, it's also the moon
and Ramadan.
Ramadan. And it have to be Jewish holiday, right? Oh no, sorry. That's the 73 war was during Ramadan and Jewish holiday. But so it have to be the moon. It has to be, the waves. There's a lot of things that comes to it, not only the weather. So what other, because I love leadership, what other skills do you think Eisenhower, leadership wise style that he has? Was he was he kind of like a Noam kind of leadership, my way or the highway, or or what?
No, that was definitely Patton. Patton was the one who would slap you if you were too cowardly to fight. No, Eisenhower, I think probably his single most underrated quality is his leadership ability, because he, certainly growing up, when I did, in the 80s, and we have this idea of leadership that is very Churchillian, right? We think of great leaders as being the people who can have the soaring oratory that will inspire men's souls, whether or not it's, JFK or Barack Obama, if you're a
Vince
Democrat,
Lombardi.
right? Or Vince Lombardi,
Yeah,
but
like
like,
a
or
locker
or
room,
Ronald
right?
Reagan,
Yeah.
right? Exactly. Like we think of leaders as the people who rally to
Yeah.
action and can mobilize. And what that often overlooks is that the people who really get things done are the ones who can really just motivate the right people in the right positions to get, the job done. And Eisenhower was just sort of preternaturally brilliant at leading people and getting the best people in the best positions and getting them invested in success. Because one of the great dangers of the charismatic leader, to be sure, is it often becomes about them, right? It often becomes about, their prestige and their charisma. And so inevitably what happens is the people around them slowly become either toadies or yes men, and they don't get people who can either know what they're doing or who are willing to bring, hard decisions to them. And Eisenhower had this just kind of selfless humility. And I know that sounds like, airy fairy, but I think it was probably his most powerful leadership trait, where he always kept his eye on the prize. And anyone who worked for him knew that he was there and he saw it as his job to take responsibility for all the things that went bad. So when he makes that call, when he says, okay, we'll go, the entire room clears out. It's this old, library in this old manor house, and he's all alone. And he writes a note. And that note is, basically a resignation letter. It's a letter saying, we made the best decision we could. Everyone did everything they could. If there is any blame to be had for the disaster that we have confronted, it is mine alone. And, that's where his mind was. He knew when he said go that it could be a disaster, if only because it is the weather. But his first instinct was to, after having made that decision, was to own it, and to own it singularly, so that and that gave him, I would say, probably again, just to your question, that gave him incredible loyalty for those who worked for them, because they always knew that he was there to get things done, not for himself, not to aggrandize himself. And that gave him the ability to get the seemingly impossible done, like launching the D-Day invasion.
That's
Now, when I was a kid, in my father's, the the version of the world that had filtered down to like a Jew in New York at the time, Eisenhower was seen as a kind of a bumbling minor figure. I think this was obviously a bum rap. Truman apparently held him in low regard. Let's start there. How is it that somebody like Harry Truman could have referred to Eisenhower as being unintelligent and whatever else he said?
Well, I think it's because Eisenhower liked it that way, right? He was someone who, I think, because you have to remember, like, the time he lives in, everybody who is anybody, right? The major leaders of that period are people like Charles de Gaulle and Hitler and Mussolini and Stalin and Churchill and Bernard Montgomery and Douglas MacArthur, right? You can go through all of these just bigger than life personalities who, in a way, knew they were bigger than life while they were alive, and couldn't help but remind you of that any chance you got. And Eisenhower, I think, understood in his bones that the best way to direct their power to his ends was to be non-threatening, right? Was to just be just a folksy guy, right? Like, hey, I'd rather be out here going fishing, or, if this army thing don't work out, I guess I'll just go be a cowboy in Argentina. But it was that sort of humility, right? And he smiled like he was selling Coca-Cola, right? Like, think about how we know him now, but he's a general. He's a 4-star general who's just smiling like he's trying to slap you on the back. And that had a profoundly disarming effect on all the people who it was extremely important that they were disarmed, because they could interfere with his ability to get things done. They would see him as a threat. They wouldn't trust him. And when you have someone like Eisenhower, who Charles de Gaulle, Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin all say they entrusted implicitly, and they did, that's someone who understands power, and that's someone who can use power. And so he understood probably better than anyone that his sort of good old boy affect and bright smile and the impression that he gave that he would just rather be golfing than doing anything else was probably the most potent political weapon he had, because he needed, people to both trust him and, not oppose him, more importantly.
Is there any modern day figure, politician, military person that you would say reminds you of that mold?
Yeah, I think Reagan certainly embodied that. I think like, even George W. Bush. I'm not a huge George W. Bush fan, as you know. But the whole sort of like, I just like clearing brush in Crawford, Texas. He didn't do it as persuasively as Eisenhower did, and he was not nearly as capable as Eisenhower.
Well, yeah, I was gonna say
but
George W. Bush might have been a still water, but he didn't run deep. Like like Eisenhower obviously had all that substance beneath the surface, right?
Right, exactly. But again, George W. Bush was a much cannier, smarter political operator, to be sure, than he was often given credit for. And he is certainly the kind of character who was able to very effectively cultivate an image of a guy who just, who you want to have a beer with, even though he didn't drink, where the most you could say about him was he was this bumbling idiot. And that, I think, did have the effect of disarming a lot of the American public, for sure. And it made it very easy for people to say, well, the real brains of the operation is Dick Cheney or Don Rumsfeld. People who could be replaced, fired, or at least that he could separate himself from, without necessarily losing his political popularity. He didn't do it as well as Eisenhower, but that kind of political shtick where, someone who, like in Eisenhower's case, went to West Point, read Nietzsche and Clausewitz and, all sorts of great minds, and incorporated their thinking into his own speeches, or someone like George W. Bush, right, who went to Yale and Harvard Business School, can come and present themselves as just folks, is, a very American political style, but one that almost Eisenhower kind of pioneers. And he's really, JFK is often given credit, but Eisenhower is really the first TV president. And he understood that this sort of gentlemanly, grandfatherly image that he cut, as president, certainly, always, more or less always, worked to his benefit and gave him the ability and the space to make really hard decisions, without people always suspecting what he was up to.
Yeah, I shouldn't have said George Bush didn't run deep. I'm sure. I mean, I don't want to belittle George Bush. I just don't think he compares to Eisenhower's depth of thought and.
Oh no, yeah, of course, yeah.
Now Eisenhower opposed the atom bomb. Is that right?
He did, actually. His view, and he even said it at the time, right? Because that's something it's very easy to say in retrospect, but even at the time, his view it wasn't his responsibility. But he did express the view that, with Japan basically licked, like, why do we have to be bombing them like this? Like, this is something that we can wrap up, without having to, kill tens of thousands of civilians, hundreds of thousands, ultimately. And that's kind of an amazing thing, right? Because he's the president who, builds up America's nuclear arsenal to the size it almost remains today. But he, was ultimately pragmatic. He's not a blood and guts kind of guy. Would he have felt differently had it been a question of using it in Europe, and had the war been going the same way in Europe? I don't know. And I think he would be even willing to say, I don't know, right? Because that was sort of like, I think one of his great attributes is a certain level of humility, and knowing that making a decision is much more difficult when it's your responsibility than
he would have to use it if he knew the Nazis were about to get it, right? That would be, I think, no choice situation, but.
Sure, but let's say Berlin was holding out the way Tokyo was, and there was a real need to, there was a real danger of losing hundreds of thousands of Americans in an assault on Berlin. Would he have used it? I don't know, right? And I don't think he knows. And I think he, from what I know of him, I don't want to speak for him, obviously, but he did have the humility to know that when other people, it's hard to make decisions, right? He had to make that weather call.
Are you saying that he actually agreed that we would lose hundreds of thousands of Americans and was against the bombing, or was he just?
No, I think it was just his direct quote was, "Well, we already have the Japs licked, so why are we doing this?" And that was, his, as much as he said. I don't know that he wasn't in that room, and so I think we have to have a certain amount of humility about it. But he also knew what it meant, because one of the things that's I think pretty new in this book that I wrote, that I found, was, like, he gets warned that the Nazis might use nuclear weapons against the beaches of Normandy on an invasion. There's a It's a Saturday afternoon. He basically gets told by George Marshall back in Washington, "Hey, you have to meet with this major," and that's a bit strange, just right there, right? Like Eisenhower is a four-star general at this point, and there are plenty of lesser generals who are going to tell him anything. But this major comes in the afternoon, and he's told you can only meet with this major, right? You have to meet with him privately. You can't even have your staff in the room. And he's like, all right, fine, whatever. And then the major closes the door and sits down and says, so there are these things called nuclear weapons. And we don't think the Germans have succeeded yet in building a fission bomb. However, we are pretty confident that they have the capability to use radiological weapons. And based on our studies done last summer, if they basically sprinkle radioactive dust on the beaches of Normandy, anyone who crosses that beach, who stands on that beach for more than a few hours, is likely to develop, leukemia, radiation poisoning. Their hair will start falling out. Anyone who's exposed for a few days is likely to die. There's nothing you can do to prevent it. Water won't wash it away because it's in sand. There's no protective equipment that we've developed effectively to resist sort of the gamma rays that are causing all of this. We're doing our best to detect it by opening up cans of closed film to see if the film is getting exposed in the can, which is really the most reliable way of determining it. Oh, and you can't tell anyone. You can't tell Omar Bradley, who's going to be crossing that beach with his men on June 6th. You can't tell Bernard Montgomery, who's going to be crossing the beach on that day.
He's the British general, right?
He's the British general, yeah. Basically Omar Bradley's counterpart, although technically he technically outranked Omar Bradley. You can't really tell anyone except for a few people in your inner circle. You can take some precautions to alert the medical personnel, but we ask that you don't tell them why. You just say, be on the lookout for strange headaches, strange cancers, people losing hair and fingernails, and good luck to you. And then he leaves. And Eisenhower is just left with this information, and he, talks with a few of his very senior advisors and shares it with them. They contemplate basically not quite violating the order, but sort of pushing at the edges of it to at least tell some of the high-ranking military commanders what could be waiting for them on the other side of the beach. But Eisenhower ultimately changes his mind and makes the decision. There's nothing they can do. There's nothing I can do, and so I'm not going to tell them because they don't need to know. And they're very circumspect about documenting any of this. I was able to find a couple of sort of documents that I had never seen, recorded anywhere else, where they're basically say, don't write this down. There's nothing about this that you're allowed to write down. They did write that down, interestingly enough, but anything else you can't write down. And 2 weeks later, with D-Day only about a week and a half or 2 weeks away at that point, Eisenhower just sends a very circumspect message back to Washington to his commanding officer, General Marshall, saying, so I met with that guy and I haven't heard anything else from you. So I'm assuming it's not a big risk, but how worried should I be? Let me know, is everything okay? And here's nothing back. And that's one of the, strains of leadership, like the stresses of leadership, which is why I think he would have a lot of humility if he was ever asked, what exactly would you do in the dropping of the bomb? Because, a lot of being a leader, especially of high risk operations like this, is all sorts of risks that you can't know how to weigh, or the odds. You're preparing for so many things that will never happen, and there are things that you don't know that will happen. One of the things that after D-Day, they find in a number of the bunkers these vials marked botulism or anthrax, sorry. And they're like, well, what's the sign of an anthrax attack, right? And they realize ultimately these are vaccinations. And they're like, well, wait a minute, why are these guys all getting vaccinated? Like, are the Germans using biological weapons? And they ultimately track it down, and they realize that these guys had been in Eastern Europe, and there was a high incidence of botulism and anthrax in Eastern Europe, et cetera. But, that's, the kind of risks that you just have to take extremely seriously. And they're like, okay, we now have to bring all the water we're going to drink in France over from England, because we can't be sure if the Germans aren't poisoning the wells and local water supply in order to resist the invasion force with biological weapons, right? Like that's how heavy the crown is.
You know,
in a position like that.
when I hear you, this is just a little bit of an aside. When I hear you describing all these threats to humanity, low tech things that existed were coming up. You know, we're getting close to 100 years since these horrible weapons were existed. It does bring to mind to me that despite the apparent outcome being a debacle in Iraq and our mischief in the Middle East, that the motivation for doing those things, for those endeavors of trying to head off at the pass, the combination of these low tech weapons with murderous jihadist ideology was not a trifling thing. It wasn't just America going overboard for U.S. Fruit Company or whatever, you know, whatever they try to say. And the book is not finished on all that. It just really isn't. It's very, very scary to think that these kinds of horrible things are going to be at the fingertips. At some point, they're going to be at the fingertips of anybody who wants them.
Well, they are
And
now, right? Like
yeah,
the Soviet, or sorry, the Soviets, the Russians have been rattling the nuclear saber.
I'm talking about like the
Almost
sprinkling of the radioactivity, the anthrax,
yeah,
like you know, like Iran, like you know, what will they do, what they won't do. And one thing October 7th brought home was that we can't just assume they won't do the things that we think they're deterred from doing. Like, you know,
yep.
Hamas would never do that because they know if they did that, we destroy them. Well, no, but they would still do it, you know? They might
Yeah.
even miscalculate. So anyway, now
Yeah.
Eisenhower was also against Vietnam.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I want to add just
Hatem wants to speak up for the jihadists. Go ahead.
something because I like how you like a little like he would not let it go. I promise, Michelle, we'll talk about your book, but he have
he
to do it.
sprinkled the
No,
radioactive
You have
dust
to, yeah,
into
sprinkle
the.
Well, let me
put
before you say
jihadi-
Hatem, before you say it, I want you to say part of reading history, the intention of reading history, I believe, Michelle can correct me, is to help us draw lessons to the current day. It's not. I'm not really changing the subject. He's writing a
Correct.
book, and these are examples to help us think about how to view the world today. So it's not like
No,
crazy.
I was joking about that part, but one of the most important lessons that we should learn as well, and Michelle knows that because he was a lawyer in Guantanamo Bay in a lot of cases, that bad weapons, not only in the hands of bad people are dangerous, in the hands of good people are dangerous. If we don't have that many destruction, how many people would have died so far in innocent people, regardless, you know? So it's not only jihadists, it's sometimes people that look good and wear suits and stuff like that and can make the wrong decisions, you know?
No, it's only jihadists. Okay, now,
Well,
now
actually,
sure.
no,
I'm
no. In
sure.
answering, both your question and I think bringing that around, right? I
Because
think
just to add to it, Michelle, as of yet, the only people that had those weapons used them.
yeah, the nuclear. Well, but I think so. This is one of the things that I feel like Eisenhower doesn't get enough credit for, and that is he is the only president, certainly of the 20th century. And I'd have to go back a little further and think a little harder. Just maybe with a couple of the guys who lived like a week. But he's the only president of the 20th century who didn't start a foreign war. Now, we had some covert actions and I'm not excusing that, right? Eisenhower is not a saint, and I'm not trying to beatify him, right? Whether or not it's what he did in Iran or in Guatemala. But the idea that he's the only American president who didn't start a foreign war, I think, has everything to do with the fact that he was someone who literally personally ordered the deaths of millions of people. And he understood that, right? And I'm not saying he did that cavalierly or glibly, or that he was that's what being the Supreme Allied Commander for Europe in World War II meant. And there were American lives, there were German lives, French lives. One of the things I talk about in the book, which has gotten surprisingly less coverage in histories of World War II than you think it might, was the Allied bombing campaign against France in advance of D-Day, where tens of thousands of French civilians were killed. And it was extremely controversial. You had letters from the Pope and cardinals, the Catholic Church, pressing the Knights of Columbus in Boston, pressing Roosevelt in an election year to stop the bombing of Italy, at least. And Eisenhower went forward with it, knowing that tens of thousands of civilians would die, because it was essential. His men told him, and he believed them, that it was essential to be able to slow the German advance on D-Day. And he brought that, I think, wisdom of what war really is to the White House. Speaking about Vietnam, like once America became involved in Vietnam in the 1960s, Eisenhower was on side, right? Let's not put too rosy a picture on
I don't know.
Eisenhower's.
I don't know this history.
Yeah.
I really don't know. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, so a lot of people tried to get Eisenhower to speak out against the Vietnam War, and he never did. He actually spoke out in favor of American forces, right? He was ultimately a patriotic soldier, army general, and former president. So he was not about to throw Lyndon Johnson or anybody else under the bus for Vietnam, even though Omar Bradley did, right? Omar Bradley was much more critical of the Vietnam War than Dwight Eisenhower was. But Eisenhower worked very hard to make sure the United States would never get involved in Vietnam in the first place. When the French were, in Dien Bien Phu, asked for American assistance to essentially bail them out as they were about to lose to the Vietnamese, Eisenhower looked at their strategic position, looked at a map, basically was like, nope, they're going to lose. This is a losing bet. We're not going to commit American lives to saving some remnant of the French Empire. When they're definitely going to lose and they've gotten themselves into a terrible position on their own making, right? He knew in a really granular way what war was, which is a kind of wisdom that very few American presidents have been able to bring to that role. And as a consequence, right, 1950s, the country was on the world was on a knife edge. And one of his greatest criticism, particularly respecting nuclear weapons in the Soviets, and one of his greatest criticisms of JFK was that he was a warmonger. His private correspondents talk about John F. Kennedy as trying to provoke a war with the Soviets. He basically, is very, how would you say, kindly critical of the handling of the Bay of Pigs. And he sees JFK's sort of bellicosity towards the Soviets being motivated primarily by domestic political considerations. And he's playing with fire, right? You can't, why are you trying to provoke a nuclear war with the Soviet Union? Small wars turn into big wars very fast. And Eisenhower just had that gut instinct for what war really was and why weapons shouldn't be used, no matter what kind of weapons they were.
Now that you've been living, have you been living and breathing Dwight Eisenhower now for a few years? Can you channel him and tell me what you think he would have thought about the Ukraine war, our contribution to provoking it, and how we should handle it, even, for whatever reason it started?
So I'm going to be very reluctant to have a seance and channel Dwight Eisenhower through myself. So a couple of the things that I could sort of draw from his strategic thought that I think would come into play. He was certainly in the 1940s, but this changes radically in the 1950s. But even in the 1940s, he was way more cooperative with the Soviet Union than almost any other military figure of the period. He traveled to Moscow in the aftermath of the war as a guest of honor. He even brought his son along. He was given essentially the second highest military honor, the highest military honor that could be given to a foreigner by the Soviet army, and he loved it and relished it as one of his favorite military decorations, primarily because it gave him the ability to ride the Moscow subway for free. And so he had a much more, certainly in the 1940s, he had a much more open-minded view towards the Russians than a lot of his contemporaries like Douglas MacArthur did. By the 1950s, though, when he's running for president, as a Republican president, no less, right, the Cold War is on, and he's going to fight the Cold War on the side of America. And that's, he fundamentally is a patriotic American. I know that sounds very cliche, but, those are the terms in which he thought about the world. It's like that. This is our side. That's theirs. If they're threatening us, I'm going to fucking threaten them. And
also, the Russians were misbehaving.
The Russians were misbehaving, right? They were, exactly, like the warm optimism of the immediate post-war period had dissipated for a lot of very good reasons by that point as well.
Yeah.
And so I think he would, but he also was, attempted unsuccessfully to open the sort of first lines of friendly communication, and that got thwarted by the downing of the U-2 spy plane, right as he was about to have a summit with Khrushchev. But nevertheless, he understood that you have to negotiate your way out of these, peer conflicts, as they say. That said, I think he would have been, I think he would have, and this isn't a political statement. I hope it doesn't sound like one. I think he would have been very um, laudatory of how the Biden administration handled certainly the first 6 months to a year of the Ukraine conflict, where because one of the things that Eisenhower believed in probably almost more than anything as a matter of American foreign policy was multilateralism, right? The United States, because it's such a powerful economy, because it has such a powerful military, because everyone in the world has every reason to fear and resent the United States, it is especially important for the United States to act in the world with allies on behalf of causes, political movements, organizations like NATO that are not itself, right? It can't behave as the empires of Europe historically did by enhancing, America first, to put a fine point on it, because that was the easiest way to build hostility to the United States and make everything the United States might want to do in the world more difficult. So I think he would have been incredibly supportive, or his strategic thought would have very much supported the way the Biden administration used American intelligence to show what Russia was up to in the fall of 2001 and the early winter of 2002 or 2022, before the invasion, which mobilized, America's traditional allies like NATO, like they have never been mobilized, certainly not since September 11th, to be prepared for the Russian invasion. I think he would have also, his strategic thought, again, I'm not going to do a seance, but his strategic thought would have been very supportive of the use of sort of slowly, incrementally providing military support to Ukraine in a way that was very calculated to not immediately provoke the Russians into escalating, right? The sort of tight, Biden gets a lot of criticism for that. Maybe that's correct, but I'm just telling you what Eisenhower's strategic thought would be very cautious and incremental. I think he would have also been quite supportive, or his strategic thought would be, very supportive of, heavy reliance on intelligence. And again, which allows the United States to pursue its interest without having to necessarily be seen as the one driving the ship. I think he would have also, and his strategic thought would have also been deeply skeptical of people like Vladimir Putin, because he saw World War II coming. He was in the Philippines. He listened on the radio when the Nazis invaded Poland. He had an early sympathy in his sort of life when he was in his early 40s, late 30s, for strongmen. Right, he admired Mussolini in the early 1930s because America was a mess. It was even more politically divided than it is today. But he also came to understand by watching what happens when strong men actually become in charge, that it ends in disaster. And he would have seen Putin for what he was, right? As a strong man who's surrounded by toadies and yes men, who's going to make terrible, reckless decisions that are ultimately going to lead to the deaths of lots of people. And so, how would he rate America? I think he would probably at least give the Biden administration a B plus, maybe, just based on, following the, lessons and strategy that he learned through hard lessons and strategy that he learned through fighting the Second World War, and then applied as president himself.
What about just to quickly wrap this Ukraine point, because I find it very interesting. What about and you can tell us what you think if you feel like it also. What about the charge that America provoked over many years, provoked Russia into this reaction in Ukraine? Would he have felt that we were provocative?
So I think it's hard to say, and again, I really don't want to. I mean, he fought the Cold War, right? He was not bashful about expanding America's alliances. He was the first general of NATO. So I don't think he would have been bashful about NATO's role. I think he would have been very clear-eyed about it. He generally was cautious, and he generally disliked symbolic politics most of all in any form, right? Anytime people started talking in grandiose terms, he was one of those people who kind of tightened up a little bit and is like, what are you trying to trick me on? So, I think that certainly would have influenced his judgment, but I think the NATO alliance, he was, again, at the very founding of it. He believed in it. He used it and expanded it throughout his own presidency, even when it was provocative to the Soviets. I think he would have been cautious about doing anything that deliberately provoked the Soviets. But by the same token, he also understood that NATO is a sort of a way of opting into the West for lots of countries who aspire to have the kind of freedom and democracy and liberal society that the West endeavors to offer, if imperfectly. And so I don't know that he would have been as critical as people like John Mearsheimer are of the United States' willingness to welcome additional nations into NATO, because that at the end of the day, he supported NATO very, very fulsomely. He led it as a military commander, and he believed in its mission. If you want my personal opinion, I tend to think, particularly the John Mearsheimers of the world, radically do overstate it. I'm not saying that's an irrational argument in a sort of pure sort of realpolitik terms. But NATO is ultimately a defensive alliance, and more than it being a security threat to the Russians, which is how the Russians, I think, have tried to portray it, it's a prestige threat, because certainly Ukraine is probably the most controversial example in the Russian mind, but lots of countries, whether or not it's from the Czech Republic all the way over to Poland, have basically voted with their feet in terms of aligning closer with Europe and liberal Western society, or aligning closer with the Soviet Union. Some countries have aligned much more closely with the Soviet Union. Belarus is an example, right? That's never really expressed too much interest, so far as I'm aware, in sort of becoming more European, and they like being within the sort of orbit of the former Soviet Union and Russia today. But when you have countries that basically make that choice, that's obviously going to be very threatening to Russian prestige, and to someone like Vladimir Putin, who cares a lot about prestige, irrespective of economics, for any number of probably domestic and personal and political reasons. That's going to be provocative. But by the same token, that's why is it that the Ukrainians have to be essentially enslaved to the Russians, right? They're a nation state. They're not Russian property. And so if the Ukrainians, through free and fair elections, want to align more closely with Europe, that's self-determination, right? That's democracy. And the Russians have to respect that just as much as we have to respect Belarus being, much more comfortably aligned with Russia than they are with Europe more generally.
The Ukraine thing fascinates me right now, but go ahead. I agree with you, but well, we could talk about it another time. Hatem, what do you want to say?
Yeah. If you have a thought, go ahead, because I'm gonna go back to Normandy. The two things that also fascinate me in that Eisenhower was versus one of the best German Rommel, right?
Yeah, Erwin Rommel.
Yeah, and Rommel was like a legend at that time. Why it didn't get covered that it was against one of the best? Like, I don't think he get enough credit because Rommel was just incredible soldier and leader.
Take it easy, Hatem.
No. In terms of
we know the history books you read.
For Rommel is understandable to a point.
He's
I'm saying when you come against, like, if you're gonna be against Darth Vader, there's no Darth Vader mentioned in history as much, you should get credit for killing Darth Vader, right? That's my point.
Totally. And totally.
And my second part of the question is, like, if D-Day did not have it, Normandy didn't happen, do you think the war would have ended the way it ended?
So yeah. And no, I'll take those questions in turn. First, I one of the things, as I said, when we started out, one of the things that drew me to this project is just how underappreciated Eisenhower kind of is by historians, right? When you look at his record, I think as president as well, but certainly in World War II, right? He doesn't get the same kind of ink spilled and sort of misty-eyed treatment that people like Patton and Churchill do. And that's one of the things that drew me to him. I was like, why is that? That's fascinating to me. And there are a lot of reasons for it that I try to explore in the book, why he kind of used his lack of seeking celebrity, right? His lack of sort of dominant stature and sort of larger than life personality, where he used, in essence, the appearance of being boring as a really just powerful political weapon at a time when that kind of weapon was both unheard of and incredibly effective. But getting to your other point, though, which I think is also utterly fascinating, right? Like, D-Day was a high-risk military operation from its inception. Winston Churchill opposed it almost up to the day it was launched, for a number of reasons, one of which was, experience in other amphibious invasions, including in the First World War, led Winston Churchill to sort of lament repeatedly that, the Channel tides will run with blood. That this, the risks involved in D-Day are astronomical, and he wasn't wrong. The actual planners, the people launching the invasion predicted, losses, casualties, meaning captured, killed, or injured, anywhere from 25 to half, right? 25% to half of the soldiers being sent across the ocean were expected to be lost in one form or another. So it was an incredibly high-risk operation that the British opposed for that reason. The British also opposed it because they had imperial ambitions in the Mediterranean that they had successfully pursued pretty much throughout the entirety of the war. And one of the great sort of big fights between the Anglo-American alliance happens at the Cairo conference when Eisenhower gets picked to lead the Normandy invasion, because Churchill basically comes to that conference and says, no, let's not invade France at all, right? Or at least postpone it, so that we can make more hay in the Mediterranean, where not only can we expand the British Empire, not coincidentally, but we can also cut the Soviets off from the Eastern Mediterranean. So Churchill had a very long view of the war the war in Europe, that really focused on expanding British preeminence in the Mediterranean and letting the Russians basically take the brunt of the German army on the Eastern Front, which they were doing obviously by the millions. And so had D-Day not happened, or even had it happened slightly differently, the entire world would be different today, right? It very quickly gets into the realm of science fiction, because if D-Day had failed, the Allies would have had to fully commit to to operations in the Mediterranean, which would have arguably, potentially cut off the Soviet Union from, places like the Balkans, but it would have made the Soviets the preeminent land power in Europe, right? There would be no, fall of France. They would be the only major military rival to Germany on the European continent. So right there, the world looks incredibly different. Had D-Day failed, right, as we mentioned before, right, the United States was working in earnest on a nuclear weapon. Now, that nuclear weapon didn't come online until about 3 months after the fall of Germany. But had we been in a position in the summer of 1945 where we're still, bombing Germany pretty consistently, where we're still cutting them off and expanding our sort of stranglehold over British commerce, over German commerce, with our control of the seas in the Mediterranean, and the Atlantic more generally, would we have used the nuclear weapon 3 months later if it looked as if, the Germans and the Russians had, reached a stalemate? Or would the Russians have cut a separate peace after the Americans showed themselves completely incapable of launching a major military operation like the D-Day invasion was? Would the Soviets have said, you know what? We've been killing each other long enough. Let's finally just, come up with some borders. We'll heavily fortify them. We'll keep Eastern Europe, and we'll let the Germans worry about France and Germany and the rest of Western Europe. And what would the role of the United States be in the world, right? The United States, it's very easy to forget. And this was one of the both challenges and kind of great joys for me in writing the book, was really just think about what the world was like in 1944. Like the reason the British Empire thought it could dictate the terms of, military strategy so that they could disagree over about, should they invade France or pursue opportunities in the Mediterranean, is because the British Empire was the superpower in the world, right? It covers a fifth of the land surface of the earth, a quarter of the world's population. It controlled the seas. It controlled the channels of communication, of commerce. London is the center of, international business and insurance, et cetera. So the idea that the British would ever cede the preeminent place in the world to the United States was by far not a foregone conclusion. And D-Day changes that, because now the United States is able to act on its own initiative. It's able to take a real leadership role militarily in the world, that it's then able to leverage into a much greater leadership position in dictating the political terms of the post-war world. And so, do you have an American superpower if the D-Day invasion fails? Or is the United States essentially, a big country that has a very large economy and sort of like a very complicated politics with 48 states that occasionally go to war with each other? Or, is it going to be a sort of a peer with Britain, and maybe the French Empire will sort of be able to reassert its preeminent place in the world? And certainly you'd have the Soviets still there, probably as the single largest world power, the single most respected world power at that point, maybe rivaling only the British Empire. So the entire world that we live in today, that we assume, that's built around international institutions like the United Nations or the World Bank or the IMF, all these institutions where the United States really was at the forefront of creating, an international world order based around democracy, freedom of various kinds, decolonization, the basic premise of liberalism. That world, would that world have come into being eventually? Maybe, but it wouldn't have come into being in 1945.
And Hatem, if that's not enough for you to root against the Americans in D-Day, there would have been no Israel.
Well, I know that. No, that one of the reasons I'm fascinated about this, because there was a story that written a long time ago about like what if the Germans won, and one of the reasons, so yeah.
All the man in high
So
castle.
Philip K. Dick, is that his name? Philip Dick?
Yeah, it was very, so also, one of the things that it's kind of cool is like they had another operation, that kind of decoy, right? The bodyguard operation.
Yeah. Operation
Imagine
Portsmouth.
it. So who did they choose to lead this one? That must be a loser. If it's a decoy operation, right?
Yeah, it's probably the single most effective military operation of the Second World War. So there's a broad sort of northern coast of France, which at the time was called the Atlantic Wall because of German fortifications that literally ran all the way from Norway to Spain. And the closest landfall they could make in France was a peninsula called Calais. And the Germans understood that very well, and so hardened Calais extremely robustly. But the Americans also understood that the Germans would think naturally you would cross in and take over Calais. And so they created an entire fictitious U.S. Army group that was almost twice as large as the actual D-Day invasion, that had inflatable tanks, inflatable paratroopers. They had people whose only job was to sit for hours, giving radio traffic back and forth that was entirely fake, to sort of create fake ships and fake radio traffic that was poised to attack Calais. And it was all headed by none other than George S. Patton. And, to the extent people like Hatem continue to admire Erwin Rommel, there was no one that the Germans feared or thought about more than George S. Patton. And so Patton is brought to England very ostensibly secretly, but very conspicuously, to lead this first army group. And it has exactly its desired effect on the D-Day invasion itself. The Germans keep a substantial number of their forces, including their air forces, in Calais, waiting for what they think is the actual invasion to come. They think Normandy is essentially a feint, or at least just the early prong of the invasion. And so George S. Patton is sitting in France, and the Germans just can't believe, George S. Patton is sitting in London, and Germans just can't believe that he's not the one leading the main invasion. And George S. Patton can't believe it either. He's furious, right? He's like chomping at the bit. He even offers Eisenhower, who's one of his oldest friends, he says, I'll give you $3,000 a week to just let me lead a company over in France, just so I can start killing some Germans already. And Eisenhower said, no, stay put, stay where you are. You are pinning down more Germans in Calais than you could ever do by being actually on the battlefield in France. And it was true. My other favorite part of this, incredibly effective and crazy story is the original name for this whole operation, this whole decoy operation, was Operation Messpot. And Winston Churchill was given a briefing on it, and he liked everything about it, but he was like, Messpot? What kind of name is Messpot? And he actually personally sent an order down demanding that it be renamed. He's like, we need something, with power, like Overlord or Operation Torch.
Like something Trump would say.
That's right. That's right.
Yeah.
That's right. And so they had to go back and rewrite all of the documents to say Operation Fortitude to ensure.
By the way, I'm not a fan of Rommel. It just I I'm from Alexandria, which is very close in Egypt, which is very close to Al Alamein.
Oh yeah, yeah, yeah.
So it's the biggest battle. So we know a lot about his defeat, because Egypt kind of stopped him a little
Yeah,
bit.
yeah. Oh no,
Over
I was just fucking with you, man. Don't
Yeah,
worry.
no, I know, but I think, like I said, like if you defeat somebody like Rommel, you should get recognition for that. I don't see Eisenhower getting that recognition. That's one of the reasons. But yeah, and D-Day stands for what? Day is that?
Yeah, literally D-Day. It's kind of an amazing thing that we think of D-Day as this one day, because D-Day itself is just military jargon for the day on which something is scheduled to happen, right? And so that when you're planning something, knowing that the day itself could shift around on the calendar, you plan by saying, okay, on D-3 we have to get this in place, and D-2, right? So 3 days before, 2 days before we actually launch. There's also H hour and even a minute, right? So that it's just essentially a jargon that's used for planning. But almost right away, this D-Day, right, June 6th, 1944, became the D-Day, and has continued to be, I think, almost as iconic as the moon landing, as this special moment. Not unlike Lexington and Concord, right? These battles that form this almost too perfect moment in the broader American story, and how America became what it is today.
I guess we're just about out of time, but I can't help it. One of the things that keeps coming to my mind, it's so corny and childlike, is it's just amazing to me that as a species, we go to war, we kill each other. We're still doing it today. We there seems to be no time when we won't do it, and there's no solution. It's an insight into human nature, which I think, in my opinion, is both very good and very bad at the same time. And we're seeing it today in Israel, but all over the world. Actually, we just focus on Israel. It's very, and you wonder, will we survive it? Will the human race survive?
Yeah.
I don't know.
So there's a moment. It's funny you say that. And not to bring it back to Eisenhower, but everything's about Eisenhower.
Yeah, sure.
For me today. Is so one of the things Eisenhower gets invited to do, because he kind of becomes a celebrity, he becomes the American in the United Kingdom, and he gets invited to all sorts of special events, and he gets invited to preside over Sandhurst's graduation, which is just about a month and a half, 2 months before D-Day itself, and he gives this very moving speech about how it's going to be up to the young men who are literally graduating that day to fight the war, because they're going to be the ones on the front line. And unlike a lot of Eisenhower speeches, there's no corny jokes, right? He doesn't crack a smile. He is dead fucking serious as he's talking, and he is waiting also. 2 months later, literally on D-Day, his own son is graduating from West Point. John Eisenhower is graduating from West Point, and he's sitting there watching these young men, graduate and walk. There's this procession essentially into the main building, which is this neoclassical building with giant pillars, and the graduates are essentially walking through this main building as sort of the concluding part of the ceremony, and it looks like these men are almost walking into a mausoleum. Right there, and he gets that in his bones, and writes to his wife this very just like personal, quiet note saying, I look at the world sometimes and I just don't understand it. Right, I don't understand how we can have this much cruelty and this much violence, and how we don't ever seem to learn anything. Right, and that's him. That's months before D-Day, like weeks before D-Day. He's not going to not do it. He knows what his job is, and he's committed. He has to do it.
Well, the game theory of it means you had to do it, because they would do it. We had to do it.
Of course, but he gets it, right. That's what I think made me really appreciate him so much. Not only as this great historical figure, but really as a human being, where he is in his private, like his public life. He has a great mask, right. It's the mask of the smiling politician, but he is so sensitive, right? He really understands what he's doing with a depth and a clarity and an investment that is rare. And it's almost stunning when you read it too. And so that's what attracted me to him as someone who I wanted to understand, because I couldn't understand him when I first encountered him. I couldn't understand why he didn't get as much credit as he did.
I do have one other question. I don't know if you have an
Yeah.
answer to it. He unleashed on the world this concept of the military industrial complex. And
Yep.
this is the go-to argument of every libertarian, left-wing person, anybody who wants to cast America in a bad light, every revisionist history talks about the military-industrial complex. Yet Eisenhower, as you've made the point over and over, was a deep patriot. To what extent is our interpretation of what he meant by that? Has it gone beyond what he meant when he said it? What was he really referring to?
Yeah, so he does not mean military, right? He does not. He believes in the military. He also believes that you can spend way too much on the military. He gives this amazing speech as president where he says that every plane that we buy is a failure because for every plane that we buy, that's 200 schoolhouses that could be educating children, right? Every missile we build is a hospital or 10 hospitals that we could be using to help the sick in this country and the needy. So he was not a pacifist by any stretch of the imagination, but he understood what he was talking about. He understood the reality of what he was talking about.
The trade-offs, yeah.
And the trade-offs, but he also he got it in a granular way that he was almost one of those people, which I think is one of his most admirable qualities. He was almost immune to rhetoric and jargon and bullshit. Like he hated that. When people talked in ways he didn't understand because they were like full of shit, he would call him out on it, and it would just be like, "I'm just a dumb bunny. Can you explain that in practical terms to me?" And so I think that's like a big part of it is that he saw that military spending should not be an end in itself, and he did not like the rhetoric, the sort of abstract rhetoric of the Cold War. And when he was referring to the military industrial complex, particularly, he was very concerned that there had become essentially a confluence of interest between what we would now think of generally as like military contractors and the government, where there was always a demand to ratchet up more military production because the military contractors made plenty of money. The people who cut the contracts in the War Department would often go back and forth between working for the military contractor and working for the government, or go from being a general in the procurement office to being a very well compensated executive in one of these armament firms. And so he got very concerned that this was a way of blindly militarizing the country without being cognizant of the trade-offs, without thinking about what the country actually needed to defend itself, because people were acting in their own narrow interests and gussying their narrow interests up in these fairly fantastical.
So he wasn't saying we're going
arguments about the missile gap.
He wasn't saying
Yeah.
we're going to war in order to line the pockets of executives and defense companies.
No, he certainly didn't think that, right? And he was that, but he did get concerned that the country was on a path to essentially wasting all of its resources in militarizing itself, and that would have a negative effect on democracy as well, because people would no longer feel like the government was working for them. We'd become obsessed with abstract, hypothetical dangers instead of the real practical needs that people had in the real world. And he was at bottom just a really practical guy. He tried to think about the world as it was. He was very disciplined about that. And so the military industrial complex he saw as something that was, ultimately going to cause a decay in the government's ability to meet the needs of the people.
I have a quick comment and then a question quickly.
Sure.
To Noam's point when he said like, I can't believe that humans are still doing that and stuff. They found a Bardi, the paper that old Egyptian used to write in hieroglyphic thousands of years, I think 3,000 or 4,000 years ago. And if it's a regular guy, and he was saying a letter to his wife is like, I can't believe the prices are getting higher, people are getting meaner. Everybody, I'm a fear for my children, what kind of world they're gonna live in. So I guess it's a human nature. It's crazy, right? It's very interesting to me. The last thing is because you're a smart man. I want to know
let's not lie to the audience now.
Who you're gonna vote for. And before that, who would play?
You must not be very smart if you don't know who he's going to vote for. Go ahead.
No, I want to know, but also who would play Eisenhower in the movie if you select. But before that, You know what's funny? What's the name of the guy? Nate Silver. I don't know if you saw that. Tweeted the exact same thing that you said 5 months ago. That he thinks that if Biden continues, he should drop from the election. And Noam said that like 5 months ago. It's like if it's
I,
free. Remember
I
that?
did see that. I did. Well, I did see that. He said he did. He said almost exactly the same way I did, which is he said that come convention time,
Yes, yes.
if they see that the writing is on the wall, that it would seem that there's a better chance than there's ever been that he might drop out because Nate Silver didn't spin the whole thing out, but because there will be, his inner circle will know and have to tell him, listen, you haven't got it, Pop. You're old, you haven't got it, and you're going to go down in history as the guy who ushered in Trump, and you want to go out with a legacy. So, I feel like they could go into a smoke-filled room, bend whatever rules they have to, and hand off the nominations to anybody essentially other than Kamala Harris, and I think they can win the election that way. And I think that is as that reality descends on them as they get closer and closer, there's a better and better chance it might happen. I'm not predicting it, but I give it 45% chance of happening.
But Noam did say that months ago.
If he hasn't got it. Now there was a thing today in Mark Halpern's newsletter. I'll forward it to you, Michelle, where he reports that he heard from inside sources that Biden's cognitive abilities have taken a kind of sudden turn for the worse. This is reported by his people from within his inner circle. If that's true, then all bets are off. And Halpern is not an unreliable reporter. But we'll.
So, Michelle, who would play Eisenhower in your movie, and then who you're gonna vote for? Or you think
I'll give you a couple answers to that. Who would play Eisenhower in the movie? I think you would. So you need someone kind of like, and this is a couple of these are going to sound strange, but like The Rock or even Tom Hanks, right? Someone who can sort of like, who has that sort of just like feral charisma that sort of like makes you sort of love them and think they're non-threatening, even though they are, right? That's why kind of The Rock is sort of almost a great, not The Rock as the wrestler, but Dwayne Johnson is the actor who can sort of like smile through a kid's movie. But also is a fairly physical guy. Eisenhower was a football player, right? He's actually a pretty we remember him as this sort of like grandfatherly figure, but he was actually a pretty physical guy in his own time.
I'm gonna have to go with Daniel.
But I would also have this.
Go ahead, Grant. Sorry.
It'd have to be Daniel Day-Lewis. There's no one he can't play, right?
Yeah, exactly.
What about Jack Nicholson?
Meryl Streep. I think Meryl Streep could probably kill him.
Meryl Streep. That would have been a great answer.
How about that guy? What's his name? The guy that was in Manchurian Candidate with Meryl Streep. What's his name? Not Denzel Washington.
He'd be good too.
Denzel would be a good choice too.
Yeah.
Black people look bald.
No, but I would actually say this, which is like in thinking about like the kind of politician that Eisenhower was. I think the closest into like modern politician who I've seen that has, he's not Eisenhower, but he has sort of a lot of what Eisenhower had, was Arnold Schwarzenegger. When he was governor of California, right? A very similar style, very much more competent and able and focused on getting things done than he's given credit for. But also had that sort of smiling, almost celebrity-like charisma that allowed people to misunderestimate him, as George W. Bush would say.
And you're right, practical and non-ideological.
Right, practical, non-ideological work. Controversial for that reason, is probably underrated as a California governor as they go. And so that would be and who am I going to vote for? Obviously, I'm going to vote, for not Trump. I think, that's it's almost irresponsible to vote for Donald Trump at this point. I think.
Do you think he will win?
I think he's a good chance of winning, of course.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think Biden really should drop out. I really think he should.
I'll throw down one last slice of history on top of this conversation. So this is a lot like the election of 1944.
Henry Wallace.
With Henry Wallace. Right, with Henry Wallace and Truman. Where at the convention, Henry Wallace gets replaced by Harry Truman in a sort of an upturning of liberal dreams that have continued to this day. And because Roosevelt was really frail. You know, that it wasn't covered, you know, the press coverage of the president was not nearly as intense as it was today, but all the same sort of swirling of rumors about Roosevelt's ill health, all the same swirling of concern that he doesn't, you know, have what it takes for a fourth term at a time of war. All the concern, you know, Roosevelt was very worried about losing the election in 1944, and so I think we're living the election in 2024 bears a lot of very eerie echoes to the election of 1944.
Well, actually, you make a very good point. I don't know why I didn't think of this, but short of Biden dropping out, they could try to trade out Kamala Harris to a shining, you know, a shiny heir apparent. That might make the difference, and everybody would understand. Well, after the election, you know, he's not long for the presidency, so it would be kind of a stealth way of changing out the candidate, because everybody knows that Biden is not going to be the president for the next 4 years. He's just not.
Yeah, it was so Roosevelt's calculation. You know, it wasn't entirely Roosevelt. It was much more broad, you know, party-based calculation. But with replacing Wallace and putting Truman in place, you know, was very much with that in mind. Was understanding that the president, you know, might not serve out the rest of his term, and Wallace had, you know, one of the reasons Roosevelt was concerned was Wallace had alienated the South and Southern Democrats, right? Sort of the future, you know, the future Strom Thurmond part of the party. And so getting Wallace off the ticket was used as a way of essentially solidifying Roosevelt's Southern base.
Look, I would say the chance of Biden winning the election is 50-50, let's say, and the chance of Biden being president in 2028 is almost zero. That's what I would put it. So that writing is on the wall. The party needs to take that seriously. Nobody wants, even among Democrats, nobody wants Kamala Harris as president, let alone handling as commander in chief of 2 wars. This woman is not up to that job. She's just not.
Well, the nice thing about being a historian is that I don't have to know anything about the future. So I'm firmly committed to telling you about the past.
Why did you call it light battle?
when you start talking about irresponsibility, and I agree with you about Trump, you know, shooting. I just had this conversation last night. I just don't want a president who's shooting from the hip with 2 wars going on in the world. You know, my gut tells me blah, blah, blah. I want Kissinger and Nixon being very, very measured and careful about what they do. But having said that, I don't know what's more irresponsible, a Kamala Harris presidency or a Trump presidency. I guess you would say the Trump
presidency for sure,
because she'll still have a team. She'll still have a team around her.
And I think so. And I think if the baby boomers have bestowed on the United States one thing, and I apologize to many of my readers who are baby boomers, to be sure, is, you know, the presidents we've had who've been baby boomers, right? So Clinton, Bush, Obama, and then Trump. You know, I feel like the country has become exhausted by being led by people who are working out their personal issues in the presidency. And, you know, having someone that, maybe that's one of the other things that attracted me to Eisenhower, is he was just a professional, right? He wasn't, he didn't really see, he was a competitive guy. He wanted to win. And when he committed to running for president, you'd be damn sure he was going to win that election. But it wasn't anything he felt he needed, right? And that's the kind of person I think we are missing in public life. People who really are working out of a sense of genuine public spiritedness and who don't need it, right? They don't need it for their own psychological reasons.
But can you imagine any of these people having to face the gauntlet of today's media, today's social media? Like they would find something, they'd take some sentence that he said, they'd find Mamie had a flag, like they'd always drum something up. It's a terrible world we're living in.
Oh sure,
for this stuff.
And it was pretty rough and tumble at the time. Like Eisenhower, again, as much as I admire.
No, they covered for Kennedy. Like if you think of just the stuff that they covered up, the press corps covered up for Kennedy, his sickness, his mistresses. I mean, basically everything. You know, it's
no, I get that, but every era has its own sort of like weird controversies. Ours tend to be a lot into people's private lives, but in Eisenhower's time, right? And again, I don't think he's a saint. I have a lot of problems with many of the things that he did. And I try to present a very accurate and sort of candid portrait of him, as admiring as I am. But like in his dealing, for example, with McCarthy, right? He allowed a lot of people to get very hurt, to lose their livelihoods, who committed suicide because he didn't want to take on Joe McCarthy because it wasn't a political fight he wanted. He wanted to consolidate his base in the Republican Party. He arguably, and he regrets this, he says this himself, sold out George Marshall, who was probably his greatest mentor and patron. When McCarthy started attacking Marshall, Eisenhower didn't stand up for him. Instead, gave a rally with McCarthy in Wisconsin during the 1952 election. Eisenhower imposed the what basically come to be called the Lavender Scare, right? Basically forcing homosexuals out of government in the Defense Department and the State Department based on being gay in the context of the Cold War. And so everyone is subject to the problems of their time and often regrets things they did. So again, I'm not presenting too rosy of a portrait of Eisenhower. I hope you don't misunderstand me. But I do think the big difference between then and today is that he was one of those people who just, who saw public service as a public good, who had a real sense of history and cared about history and understood his place in history and acted accordingly. And I just don't know that we have that. That's just not our environment today.
No, we
and
don't.
at least we haven't had too many political leaders who've followed suit.
We got to go. Every leader that you list in this cast of character, Marshall, I mean, all of them. None of our leaders measure up to these people for some reason. For some reason, we just don't have that right now, except for Donald J. Trump. All right, we got to go.
Well, Michel, thank you so much. Where people can find your book and where are you going to be? I know you're doing some tours.
Yeah. I'm just doing some touring with the book. You can pre-order it now, and you can get it at bookstores everywhere on June 4th. And yeah, I hope people like it.
I'll leave the link in the description as well.
And we'll see you on Tuesday, maybe.
Yeah, see you on Tuesday.
All right, thank you very much, guys. Have a great night.